There are other types of formats that you can save data in beyond the tabular format, beyond or the CSV file or text file. These are also textual formats, but they're a little bit different from the tabular data that we've talked about before. And the two main functions for writing out data are dumping and deputting. So, and the idea behind these types of formats is that they're text formats, but they're not really formatted in a way that's in the same as like a table, because they contain a little bit more metadata. So data about, for example, the type of the data in each object, for example. So if you dump or you deput a data frame, it will include in the output the class of each column of the data frame, so you don't have to specify it when you read it in. And so the advantage of using this type of mechanism to store data or to read data is that you don't have, it's still a textual format, which can be useful, but it also contains metadata, so that you don't have to specify it every single time you read it in. Because then, if the metadata do not get carried with the data set itself, then they can get lost if they get transferred somewhere else. And if you don't remember what the metadata are, for example, the classes of the different columns, then you kind of have to reconstruct that from scratch. So that's one advantage of using a function like dump or deput to output data from R. And similarly, the functions for reading data that have been outputted using dump or deput are source and dget. So in general, textual formats are very nice formats for storing data, because there's a number of different types of different advantages to them. First of all, they're editable, so you can, if you want to, you can edit them. I wouldn't say this is something that I would advise, but because you wanted something that's reproducible. But for example, if something gets corrupted, then you can look at the file to see if it's possible to recover it. So textual formats can be a little bit longer lived. If you're going to be storing data for a long time, sometimes it's useful to, if it's possible, to use a type of textual format, so that you can avoid potential problems with corruption. Textual formats can also work better if you're using like a version control program like Subversion or Git, where you're tracking changes between documents. And those types of programs tend to be much more useful with textual data rather than binary data, so that you can track changes meaningfully. Textual formats adhere to the general kind of Unix philosophy, which is to store all kinds of data, which generally stores all kinds of data in text. But the one downside with textual formats is they tend not to be very space efficient. So they tend to take up a lot of space, and so it often need to be compressed. So the deput function takes an arbitrary R object, and it will take most types of R objects except for some more exotic ones, and it will create some R code that will essentially reconstruct the object in R. So here I'm creating a small data frame. It's got two columns. The first column is called A, the second column is called B. And then I'm going to deput this data frame, and you'll see if you just call deput, it will just output the result to the console. And you can see that what I've done is, it's constructed some R code. For example, it's creating this list that has these two elements in it, and you can see that each element has the data that's in it, and it has the names embedded here. It's got the row names here, and it has the class of the object, which in this case is a data frame. And so all the metadata here, like the row names and the names and the class, are all included in the output. Now, of course, you generally don't want to print this to the console. It's not particularly useful. You probably want to save it to a file. So you can deput the object to a file, and then later on, you can read it into R using dget. And when you dget the object, you'll get this object, and you'll see that you've kind of reconstructed the object from before. So the deput function essentially writes R code, which can be used to reconstruct an R object. The dump function is a lot like dget. However, the difference is that the dget can only be used on a single R object, whereas dump can be used on multiple R objects. And so what you do is that what you pass to dump is a character vector which contains the names of the objects. So here I've created two objects, one called X, the other called Y. And what I pass to dump are the names of those objects. So the names are X and Y, and I give it a file that I want to store the objects in, and then I can remove them if I want to. But to read those objects back into R, I can call the source function on that file, and you'll see that the Y object and the X object have been reconstructed.